welcome to our debate as part of the Fabian series on the issue of Scottish independence with Ian Blackford. So the purpose of these kind of debates is to kind of take important kind of significant issues in society, both in the UK and globally, and bring in significant figures from those movements, from those issues, and have these kind of forums where we can discuss and debate them and really get into the depths of what these issues are that are affecting us. In the past, the Debate Society has run debates on the Brexit and the second independence, second EU referendum, getting our referendums mixed up, where we had the leader of UKIP and also someone from the People's Vote movement in attendance. We've also had debates about Extinction Rebellion and the climate movement, where the founders of Extinction Rebellion were present. We've also had a debate about the movement in Hong Kong with the chair of the Hong Kong Democratic Party, and also a debate about the situation in Kashmir. So we're really excited to be talking about Scottish independence today, which some of you might be able to tell from the accent is an issue that I'm particularly familiar with, being from Scotland myself. I was 13 when the referendum first happened in 14, and that was very much my first introduction to the world of politics, to see how leaders debated, how people voted, how people were influenced. So that was really what got me on the track to now studying a degree in politics and IR, which I'm in my first year of. So here tonight to talk about this issue, we have the Right Honourable Ian Blackford, who was elected in 2015 as the MP for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, which is kind of up in the north of Scotland. And then in 2017 he became the SNP leader in Westminster, so he's the one who leads debates and is the voice of the SNP group in Westminster, who are the third largest party. Moderating the discussion, we have Hamza, who's a member of the Debate Society, who's a very accomplished person in many ways, currently co-authoring a book, having had several jobs, as well as studying a degree himself. We don't quite understand how he does it. But moreover, he's a very experienced moderator, having moderated a range of discussions with political leaders, with academics, with journalists, and also moderating our previous debates. So I'm very massive thank you to everybody for being here. I'd like to pass over to the speakers to start what will hopefully be a really interesting discussion.
There we go. Before we start, just a few rules of housekeeping. So first, Mr. Blackford has a set of opening remarks that he'd like to deliver. Following that, we have a brief moderated discussion, following which we have a question and answer session with the audience, which we hope will be the bulk of this event. Secondly, there's a question and answer session at the end, so just remember that I'll take men and women in equal measure. So if I don't come to you for a bit, please take this chance to introspect. Secondly, please make it a question. Even if it's not a question, just affect a high rise at the end of your sentence so it sounds like a question. That would be helpful. With that said, it's an honor. Mr. Blackford, please.
Thank you for the invitation to meet me. You know, I was just listening to what Katrina said, and someone that remembers the referendum in 2014 very clearly. I live in the Isle of Skye, and we had a yes shop in the main street, in the main village in Skye called Portree, with the local high school just around the corner. Somebody you may know that 16 and 17-year-olds were given the vote in that referendum, something I was very pleased that we did. And it was just fantastic to see the engagement that we had with young people. Whether people voted yes or no, it doesn't matter. But it was just absolutely uplifting just to see that engagement that we had. Katrina said about Ross, Skye and Lochaber being very far in the north. It's just about as far north and west as you could get. It includes a number of islands. And when I was elected in 2015, I was actually the first MP to live in Skye since 1833. The distinction being that the then member for the constituency was the Baron of Glenelg, who owned the Waternish estate in Skye, which is actually where I live. But I, on the other hand, I just own a croft, so it's very different to my predecessor. Anyway, let me begin by thanking you for the kind invitation to be here this evening. It's a great pleasure to speak as part of the Fabian series, a series which I know continues to be a real success, attracting prominent speakers, some that I would agree with, perhaps some I would disagree with, and engaging students throughout the campus. In true Fabian tradition, I've been told that there has been no shortage of lively, thoughtful and impassioned debate something our political discourse depends on and should be encouraged. In making these opening and brief remarks, I'm very conscious of the words of the great Fabian George Bernard Shaw, who once rightly observed that the single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place. I suppose that's a common flaw in our modern politics, a failure to know the difference between talking at people instead of talking with them, and I hope that's something we managed to do tonight. It's important to start by saying that any discussion on the major issues we now face, be it Scottish independence or indeed other questions in terms of the overall foundations of our economic and social architecture, need to be placed in the context in which we are now living. I think all of us have an innate sense that we're not living through an ordinary time. The old Soviet saying has never rung truer. There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. In recent years, patterns of seismic political change have not been intermittent or cyclical, from financial crashes to political upheaval to various referenda, as Katrina was referring to. We have all instead been confronted and challenged with a prolonged omnibus of change. This is now the new normal that we as politicians and our electorates are faced with, and there is very little sign that that is going to end anytime soon. I'm deliberately laying out the landscape of change because I believe it's central to understanding the choice and realities that are before us. That broader reality has been a catalyst for various uncertainties and volatilities across our politics, but there's one thing which has become clearer by the day. The United Kingdom in its entirety is immersed in a constitutional crisis, and I don't say that lightly. And indeed, the United Kingdom that Scotland and I acknowledge did vote to remain in 2014 no longer exists. The union on these islands, as once was, is simply no more. It is telling in itself that the statement is basically no longer in dispute. As someone who spent all my adult life at the very heart of the movement for an independent Scotland, that wider constitutional conversation is obviously something I welcome. And one of the things that we want to do in Scotland is build a broad consensus. Whether or not people voted yes or no in 2014, it's about a discussion about the visions and the values and the type of country that we want to live in. As you know, it's a conversation that has already been well underway in Scotland for some time. However, it has now found itself placed within a much wider horizon. Most specifically, it has found its way into the fundamental consideration of our relationship with the European Union and all that that entails. Brexit was a moment of true change on these islands because it was a moment of lasting change. Now, you know, I know you're all students, and I look around the room, and I guess most of you have had all your life in that time where we've been members of the European Union. I can remember very clearly the day that we joined the European Union, the 1st of January 1973, I was 11. I was born and brought up in Edinburgh, and like a lot of people in Scotland, very much had a passion for football. And that very day, the 1st of January 1973, my team Hibs beat Hearts 7-0 and we went top of the league. So I've always, that connection between football, how I spent that day, and becoming a member of the European Union are kind of, for me, intertwined. But I'm making light of it in some ways, but I've got to be honest with you, that I cannot bring myself to reconcile what has happened. Because I am European, and as an individual, I've lived and worked in the Netherlands. My son lived and worked in the Netherlands, and I grieve that the opportunities that my generation had to live, to work, to travel, to get an education in Europe is something which is no longer available as a matter of right. And I cannot come to terms with what that means. That beauty, and I mean that beauty, of the free movement of people, the ability for us to learn that cultural diversity that we've had, those that have come to live and work in Scotland and to be part of our story, cannot be right. Cannot be right what we're doing. Breaking apart from the European Union and the economic and societal choices that flow from it now have an ever-shifting water table beneath our feet. It is unsettling all the political ground which rests upon it. The typical and trite attack on my party is often that the only objective and instinct is to cause division. That attack line is now more than slightly ironic. because it was not my party's choice, nor that of the Scottish people, which has enabled this break-up from the benefits of the European project. Scotland did not give our consent to this break-up. In fact, our people in the referendum and every election since have rejected both the people and the vision behind it. The issue of consent is not without significance, as to govern without consent is not morally acceptable, and of course, historical constitutional principles are important in this regard. Whilst it is accepted that parliamentary sovereignty is the established practice in England, it is most certainly not in Scotland. Indeed, this year is the 700th anniversary of the Declaration of Our Oath, that specifically limited the power of the King as the King of Scots, but only ruling with consent. If I take it what I would class as more modern times, there was the court case in 1952, McCormick versus the Crown, where Lord Cooper gave his judgment, and he said, and I quote, that parliamentary is a purely English concept that has no parallel in Scottish constitutional history. It is the people that are sovereign. It is interesting that in the last number of months, divergence has become the watchword of the trade talks that are underway in Brussels. But in truth, that word stems back to the 2016 referendum in Scotland, and it must be said Northern Ireland. A divergent choice was made across these islands. That difference in choice hasn't and isn't going away. Amidst all the complexity of the last few years, it means one simple thing. The future voted for by the Scottish people is not compatible with the future that we are now being offered within the United Kingdom. It is not compatible with the future being imposed upon us by those that are pursuing their Brexit fantasy. On the eve of the budget, it is also important to say that the divergence isn't simply or solely a product of the constitutional upheavals that have been going on in recent years. For some, the clarity of the choice has perhaps become stronger, but its roots are much deeper. For Scotland, the choice of independence and the growing support for it is equally a result of our bitter experience of a broken Westminster system, which has made the political choice to enforce an austerity agenda over the course of the last decade. Let me give you some examples of that. During the course of the last decade, the Tories have stripped £13.9 billion from the Holyrood budget. So, set in that context, the newly passed Scottish budget for 2020-21 is still £840 million lower in real terms compared to 2010. Those cuts and the knock-on restrictions to investment in people and innovation has placed real limits on our economy. At the same time, the cuts to welfare and the introduction of universal credit have simultaneously punished the most vulnerable. And we often forget it is the working poor are the ones that benefit or are harmed most by this. The Scottish Government has done its utmost to mitigate against the damage of these decisions, and indeed we've been congratulated by the United Nations for that, but by definition, mitigations can only ever last so long and can only ever go so far. There also seems little hope that the damage of that last decade of austerity will be undone by the next. And remember also, when you look at people in work, we've had the worst decade for wage growth in 200 years. We've actually had the first decade in 200 years where people have become poorer in real terms. A real concern of recent weeks is the confirmation that the Tories are now doubling down on their hostile environment to immigration and are seeking to undermine Scotland's economic needs in terms of future labour supply. Let me just, if I may, just put that in context of what is happening with the coronavirus. As I mentioned, I live in the Isle of Skye. I don't know how many people in this room have been to the West Highlands, but tourism is the bedrock to our economy. And it's a seasonal business. And we do recruit a number of talented individuals to come and work in the industry from the European Union. Now, in the knowledge that recruitment is going to become more difficult as we move forward, many of these businesses have over-recruited this year. They've invested in their staff. But all of a sudden, at the advent of the tourist season just about to come upon us, many of these businesses are finding that they're seeing cancellations, and cancellations to a considerable extent. So people have put additional costs onto their business and through no fault of their own, they're just to be hampered by what is something I know which affects all of us. But it really does mean that the UK government has to sit and listen to the impact that the coronavirus is going to have. And I've appealed to the UK government to have a generosity of spirit in that budget, to recognise that we have to take immediate action. So, for example, by cutting VAT on hospitality businesses, by the banks putting up working capital to assist those businesses in the short term, and indeed, when necessary, the government standing behind that, just as the Italian government has done. I have to say I don't hold out much hope that the Chancellor is listening and will get the right response tomorrow. I was on the Today programme on Radio 4 this morning, and I followed Philip Hammond, and his message was that it should be a holding budget from the government, and they should wait and be ready to take action. That, frankly, isn't good enough, because action is required, and it's required now. The SNP's proposals on migration, backed by Business and Civic Scotland and designed to work within current constitutional arrangements, were dismissed out of hand by the UK government with no consideration. Add into this mix the deep uncertainty at the heart of the ongoing EU trade negotiations, with the very real risk of new tariffs and customs friction within our markets on the continent. I can't find many people that think we're going to have a comprehensive trade agreement in place by the end of this year. And that means that a no-deal Brexit is still very much with us. This is only a brief overview of the damage that past and present Westminster policies have done, policies that have ignored Scotland's interest and limited our potential. But even just a brief look at that picture allows a growing number of us to see the same thing. Put simply, Scotland's economic interests are no longer served by being part of this union. Our right to choose a new independent future requires those of us tasked with the responsibility of leadership to carefully and calmly map out the path ahead. On the eve of Brexit Day in January, our First Minister set out exactly those next steps. As you know, despite the cast-iron mandate from the Scottish public and the Scottish Parliament for a new choice on our future, Boris Johnson is currently rejecting this right. But far from showing the position of strength in which others believe they are in, it actually exposes their complete weakness. If they had any confidence in the argument for the Westminster Union, they would have no problem with the people of Scotland having that right to choose. This refusal demonstrates that far from being a partnership of equals, the UK is not even a voluntary union of nations. So despite the intransigence, we do not intend to be set on course. By way of a legitimate and a legal route, we will see this way through. Because we take heart in the knowledge that the path and destination of Scotland's independence can only ever be found through the democratic rule of our people. That is why the First Minister has announced that a new constitutional convention will be established to endorse the modern claim of right. Of course, a claim of right that has its roots in the Arbroath Declaration I referenced earlier. This will seek to affirm the sovereign right of the Scottish people to choose their own future, and will build support among Civic Scotland for that objective. To inform these choices, the Scottish Government will also launch the New Scotland series of papers, which will provide detail on how Scotland can make the transition from a yes vote to becoming an independent country. Because that path of persuasion through which we are winning the constitutional argument, and it is ultimately how we will achieve our independence. Let me finish on this note. When the Fabian Society was founded in 1884, its stated purpose was to reconstruct society in such a manner as to secure the general welfare and happiness. 135 years on, it would be difficult for anyone in this Union of Nations to argue that this vision is anywhere close to being realised. The landscape of the last decade, of austerity, of Brexit, of deep uncertainty and instability has come home at a great cost. It is therefore little wonder that more and more of our citizens are seeking to escape that prolonged austerity and escape Boris's Brexit. Rather than the instability and limitations offered by the UK, an independent Scotland now offers the Scottish people both stability and opportunity. Scotland as a destination within the European Union. If the 2016 Brexit referendum was the moment when our political futures make a point of divergence, we are now at the cusp of the moment of Scotland's choice, for Scotland's people to choose its own future. Our future must be ours to choose and we will very shortly make that choice. I'm confident that Scotland will choose to be an independent, equal European nation. Thank you.
So let me start off by perhaps a preface that as a Pakistani, I find the prospect of a country seeking independence from the United Kingdom quite enticing. But with discussions of independence comes disunity. Now, you've often mentioned how the Prime Minister has divided this country over the issue of Brexit. Why is the discussion on Scottish independence going to be different from it, in your opinion, and not attract the same sort of vitriolic conversation that plagued the Brexit discussions for the past 4 years?
Well, thank you, because I think that is an absolutely key question. And I'm appalled at the debate that we've had around Brexit, what happened in the referendum in 2016 and everything which has happened beyond that. It's been bitter, it's been divisive, it's been hateful. We've seen an increase in hate crime over the course of the last few years, and I have to say I think Brexit has to take, or the Brexit process has to be a contributive factor to that. You know, it would be interesting. Katrina, I know, was a young woman, very young woman, at the time of the referendum in Scotland. It'd be interesting to get her take on this, because my reflection, having mentioned the young people that came into our shop in Portree and Skye, is it was an engaging process. Because it was about hopes, it was about how we saw our future. And I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we're always right and those on the other side are wrong, far from it. And it's why I've expressed this desire to have this national conversation, to have this convention that the First Minister is talking about. Because we want to encourage people to engage in debate with us. And the whole point about what we're seeking to do is unite the country. And I understand, I really do understand, why some people were frightened in 2014. I remember there was a young woman that I spoke to in a jeweller shop in Edinburgh. She was getting married, she was buying a house. She said to me that she felt very Scottish, she wanted to vote for independence, but she was scared. We have to inspire people. We have to, out of the stramash that is Brexit, show them that there is another way. And it does come down to this discussion about what kind of country that we want to live in. And for me, it's very, very simple. And I actually, you know, I would argue, when I talk about independence, in a sense, I'm talking about interdependence, but whether that interdependence is on a European scale, in the European Union, or more globally. Because actually, when you look at small countries around the world, and I'm not making a broad generalisation, but actually, when you do any analysis, you'll see that smaller countries tend to have better outcomes in health and education. Now, you can ask yourself, why should that be the case? And I would say to you that there's a simple reason for that, and that is that small countries have to be competitive. You have to create a competitive advantage. And therefore you need a well-educated population, and you certainly need a healthy population. What you also tend to find as a consequence of that is you actually deliver higher growth rates. That's true whether you're looking at Europe or whether you're looking elsewhere in the world. But interestingly, on balance, you find that taxation rates are slightly lower, but tax collection rates are higher. Now you could debate the reasons for that. I think one of the reasons for that is because you create more cohesion within society. Now, I know that's a kind of long answer to your question, but it's this desire to bring people back together. And I want, in a referendum, I want to win that referendum well. But I also want to create space for those that don't agree with us at that moment, that they can come with us too. And I think one of the things out of the whole Brexit process, with I often refer to as the Brexit fanboys that are currently in number 10, there's never been losers' consent, because they've never understood that there were two sides to the, I was going to say discussion, but let's leave it at discussion, I'll leave it like that. So we want to learn from everything which has happened with Brexit. And what I want is to create a society which is not based on ethnicity, it's simply based about the values that give up to the country which we live in, and those that want to come and participate in our future slowly.
But this agreement and disagreement stems from the terms being debated, right? So the Prime Minister is very fond of saying, leave means leave. What does leaving mean exactly? Because a lot of people
In
are
the context
confused
of
by this
Brexit.
question. Let's start specifically with the future of Scotland's relationship with the United Kingdom more generally. What would that mean?
It would be a partnership of equals. So, but all we're asking is that we take responsibility to create a better society, to create a fairer society, to create a society where we take our responsibilities for climate change. And actually, you know, when I look at the rear view mirror, so let's start with that, and I look at Scotland's population, and I see a country that over the course of the last 100 years has not grown. If you look at the census in 1911, our population is 4.8 million, which is around about 5.5 million now. So something has happened. There's been a lack of economic opportunity that has allowed young people to stay and contribute to the growth of Scotland. And that shames me. And actually, I talked about Waternish when I live in Skye. 35% of the population of my district are over 65. So we face a ticking time bomb from that ageing of society. So we have to change the record. We have to take responsibility so that we can accelerate economic growth. And actually, in a broad sense, I guess most of you are studying economics in some way, shape or form. Maybe that's a wrong assumption. But I actually don't believe that there are structural supply side constraints in Scotland. Yeah, of course, you've got to create the architecture when you deliver on that. So that's the bit we'll take our responsibilities from. But when it comes to the rest of the UK, what I want is a partnership. I want a social union. And you know, I would say to you, look at the experience of Ireland, a country that had a difficult history with the United Kingdom.
That's why I'm asking, because there is talk of a Scottish backstop now, which gets quite interesting.
Let's not use the word backstop in this context.
Yeah.
But I want to use the example of Ireland, of a country which is self-confident, of a country which is prosperous. And actually, if you went back 70 years ago, 90% of Ireland's trade was with the UK. You know what it is now? 11%. Because what you've got is a country which is global and outward. And that's what I want to achieve for Scotland. A Scotland that can achieve its potential, but one that sees the rest of the UK, and principally England, as its dearest friend, as its nearest neighbour, but one where we achieve that based on equality.
In all fairness, even in the case of Ireland, the first 20 years they had to go through some significant austerity measures to reduce deficits, increase taxes, etc., etc. A lot of people fear that post-independence, Scotland will be left with a limited set of options, and the prime option on the table is going to be some degree of austerity. Do you think that's a claim that's empirically valid, or do you think that's not going to happen if Scotland goes for independence?
No, so look, our starting position is that we're a modestly prosperous country. So, I mean, Scotland's GDP as a percentage of the UK average is about 99%. So we're not a poor country in terms of the starting position. Of course, there has to be a negotiation that will go on in terms of what happens with the debt, how that's all configured and all the rest of it. But there may be, you know, I mean, I talked about lack of supply side constraints. Let me turn it round the other way, and let's look at the way that the UK has behaved over the course of the last 10 years. And if I even go back further than that, I think Gordon Brown creating independence in the Bank of England was a good thing to do. But we've actually now got a situation where there's a disconnect between the oversight of monetary and fiscal policy. So monetary policy having been devolved in effect to the Bank of England, and we've had a one-trick pony in the post-financial crash period, where it's all been about monetary policy, it's all been about quantitative easing, the 435 billion programme that we've seen. It hasn't been balanced by fiscal measures. And come back to what I was saying about lack of wage growth earlier, come back about the lack of productivity growth. And for us, the challenge is how we create the circumstances of sustainable economic growth in the basis of also delivering a green economy. So if you take your responsibilities rightly for fiscal policy, then you will deliver a different set of results. And I have to say, you don't deal with the financial crisis by taking cash out of the poorest in society. Now just, you know, when you think about what's happened with universal credit, when you go back and you think about working tax credits, one of the first issues I had to confront when I entered Parliament was the SNP spokesperson dealing with a Tory government that wanted to cut the working tax credit bill by 12 billion. This is the working poor who were having to pay the price effectively for the banks having crashed the economy. There's something quite warped about the political choices that were made. Our responsibility is to take the right kind of policy responses that will grow the economy. And of course I want to deliver a low debt and deficit in Scotland. But you do that through growth.
Yeah.
You don't do that by prolonged austerity.
But fiscal responsibility in the minds of many economists seems to be actually a strong argument for the unionists, because if you think about public spending per capita, Scotland is much better off than most of the rest of the UK, and at the same time Scotland gives in less in tax revenue per capita compared to the rest of the UK. For the unionists, you seem to have a pretty good deal right now.
My goodness, we'll come and tell people in Scotland that. Look, and I know why you asked the question that way, and I thank you for it. Look, if you look back over the course of the last few decades, and I'm glad to say that the UK has published its accounts for the last few years, so we can make assumptions on what Scotland has contributed and what we've got back. I take the point that over the course of the last 4 years, the decline in the oil price has made a difference to the accounts that we're talking about. But actually, if you look back over the course of the last 40 years, in 35 or 36 of those years, Scotland has actually contributed more to the UK than we've taken out. So the idea that we're subsidised is actually not true. There are swings and balances in particular years. But I come back to the fundamental point. What I want to do is change the landscape. I want to create a society which is based on delivering fairness. I want to deal with the poverty that we have. I mean, I talked about the opportunity of developing economic growth, but it's economic growth for a purpose, it's delivering that fairness. And it's not about a perception of Scotland handing out the menu bowl, it's about a Scotland that can take its own responsibilities.
Yeah. A similar discussion was also happening in 2012, 2013, 2014, and a lot of people voiced similar concerns. But the conclusion of their argument was reforming the relationship as opposed to independence. Why, in your mind, is reform impossible in succeeding?
Well, again, it's a very good question, and I remember just a few days before the referendum in 2014, there was a very famous vow. It was the front page of what was then the biggest selling paper in Scotland, the Daily Record. And it was the vow was a promise from the Conservative Party, from the Labour Party, from the Liberal Dems. It was authored by a guy called Murray Foote, who was the then editor of the Daily Record. And basically, what they argued was that we were going to get the strongest parliament, devolved parliament in the world, that we were going to get home rule in the spirit of Keir Hardie. We were going to get a partnership of equals, where Scotland was going to be listened to. Does anybody really think that's happened? Because the converse actually happened, and it was quite extraordinary the day after the referendum. And there wasn't a spirit of generosity from the then Prime Minister David Cameron, because he then talked about, now it was England's turn. And the most extraordinary thing they did was they brought in English votes for English laws. Now, I'm in favour of home rule, and I'm very much in favour of the people that live in England having control over their own destiny. But you don't do that by telling members of Parliament from Scotland that you have a second class, because that's what happened. If you're a unionist, you don't do that because you actually undermine the very thing that you seek to protect. And we had quite a ridiculous thing a few weeks ago, because they actually put up, I kid you not, and there are pictures on social media and papers at the time, in the voting lobbies, they put up boards, England. And you know, we went from a situation where there was a committee of the House that was meeting, so you actually went from the committee of the House, which was England only, back to the full House. So it was almost quite surreal, because we went from the Parliament of England to the Parliament of the United Kingdom, back and forward several times that night. I mean, it's almost barking mad what we were watching. But you know, the final point of that, and I deliberately mentioned the name Murray Foote, because Murray Foote has gone on his own journey. And just 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago perhaps, he joined the SNP in Edinburgh as our chief spin doctor. So he's made his own judgment, and I hope others in Scotland make the same judgment.
Yeah. The seminal thrust of your opening remarks seemed to be about how Scottish people are fundamentally European, and there's been a significant change of circumstances, the political lingo for it, between 2014 and 2020 in the shape of Brexit. The question then there becomes that implicitly what you're assuming is that Scotland becomes a part of the European Union. That doesn't seem very easy, does it? Let's start with problem number one. Spain is not very fond of legitimizing its own independence movements in Catalonia by saying, here's a country which became independent, let's accede them to the European Union. So in terms of getting that 27-stage agreement, how do you see Scotland doing that if it were to become independent?
I'm going to always make that kind of cheap line. Stick with me, maybe we'll get there. But the reason I'm saying that is because I've talked about the papers that we're going to publish, and we will cover specifically the process of accession, and I realise that's important. But let me deal with Spain, and let me deal with our position in relation to that. We've made it clear that we will do things by the constitutional method. That we're seeking agreement with Westminster, as we did in 2014, the Edinburgh Agreement, to transfer the powers to have that referendum to the Parliament, to the government in Edinburgh, reach agreement with the Electoral Commission. And actually I've had conversations with Spanish diplomats, so have my colleagues, and our friends in Madrid have made it clear that they make a distinction about what they characterise as a constitutional settlement that's reached by consent, and what they see as the position in Catalonia. So
out of curiosity, do you support the Catalonia movement?
I support the rights of people for self-determination, but of course everyone has to find their own way to achieve their ends, and I'm not going to interfere in what is seen as something which is specific to the people of Spain.
That's fair. The second problem then is to do with the possibility of a hard border.
Because these are opportunities.
This is Pakistan. This is how we talk to each other over the dinner table. It's, the second question then is about the possibility of a hard border between England and Scotland, because ostensibly the European Union needs to regulate the flow of commerce between what is the EU and what is not the EU. Is there a solution there?
Yeah, there are always solutions, and of course you have to put your mind to how you achieve those. And I think you're very right about saying this is a European Union border. So of course it's an issue for Scotland, it's an issue for Scotland in any independence negotiations, I absolutely accept that. But finding a solution to that can only be done by reaching agreement with our European partners. Now I would simply say, and I think it's something which perhaps haven't been addressed as comprehensively as it should have been over the situation with the island of Ireland. And that is that you can choose to use technology. So there are technological breakthroughs both in terms of software and hardware that, in my opinion, would allow you to address this issue in a constructive manner. But again, we will cover that in some detail. We don't know what the exact trading arrangements will be between the United Kingdom and the European Union post the end of this year, indeed if there's agreement by that point. And the nature of that will of course define how you deal with these issues. But I understand the challenges there, and I understand the obligations on us with others to make sure that we find a practical solution to this.
This perhaps speaks to a broader issue about chronology. So in terms of the referendum happening, there have been various barometers given by a variety of people. So the First Minister in 2016 said, once the polls say we have about 60% support, we have a referendum. John Mason said 70%. So there's numbers all over the place.
Did John Mason say 70%?
Yeah, John Mason said 70%. So these numbers seem to be all over the place. So what in your mind is the correct time to call for this formally, officially, and when you think we have the correct amount of momentum to push for the independence movement? Is there a number in your mind?
There's a number in my mind, but whether or not I want to share the number with you tonight. But let me put it this way. Democracy has to prevail in our political society that is based upon majority. Now, of course, what I will share in terms of the aspiration that the First Minister had of 60%, I want to win this argument, I want to win this argument well. But based on that principle I was talking about, sovereignty resting with the people, and I think it's crucial to state it this way with you, that we gained the mandate to have an independence referendum in the 2016 election to the Scottish Parliament, because the Scottish National Party stood on a manifesto commitment of allowing the people of Scotland to have a referendum if there was a material change in circumstances. So that has happened. And you've had the situation where the Conservatives in particular, they've campaigned on the slogan, and to some extent it worked for them as an opposition party in Scotland of saying say no to Indirect 2. That was the appeal of Ruth Davidson in every election we faced over the course of the last few years. That's what the Tories campaigned on in Scotland in the election in December 2019. Well, they got the result. They returned less than half the MPs they went into the election with. And you had the situation where the SNP achieved 45% of the vote.
This actually brings up a please.
So 20 percentage points ahead of the Conservative Party, with 80% of the seats. Now, I don't choose to have a first past the post system. I would prefer to have proportional representation. But by the rules which are set by Westminster, we won the election. And in terms of Boris Johnson taking the UK out of the European Union and having a mandate to do the things that he's choosing to do, throughout the UK he had 43% of support. And in fact, there is no government in the last 45 years has had a share of the vote that the SNP had in Scotland in 2020. So demonstrably we have a mandate, demonstrably that we have level of public support. I'd simply say in terms of the timing of this, if Boris Johnson's going to be the man that's going to continue to say no, and I hope we do have the opportunity to have a referendum this year, but if he continues to say no in the short term, then he's creating the circumstances that's going to allow us to campaign in 2021, and I look forward to that election campaign.
Which is very interesting, right? Because as a debater, we always have affirmative cases and negative cases. It seems to me that the SNP has a stronger negative case against Boris Johnson than an affirmative case for Scottish independence. Do you think that's true?
If that's the takeaway, then whether it's here tonight or any other time, or the First Minister or any other senior figure in the SNP, we haven't done our job. Because I don't want people voting for the SNP or voting for independence for wholly negative reasons. Of course I accept modern political life, that happens to an extent. But for us it has to be about ambition. It has to be about what the Scottish Government can achieve, and I would argue that the Government has achieved a lot. The Parliament has achieved a lot. That's one thing we should remember. The Parliament has only been in existence for 20 years, and I think we've been a force for tremendous change for good in Scotland, not just through the SNP, but through others as well. And I want to win independence on the basis of positive arguments about what we can achieve, not being anti anything else. Yeah, I can take Paul's and Boris Johnson, I accept that. I don't like his style of premiership, I fully accept that. But the argument for Scottish independence is about completing the powers of the Scottish Parliament. It's about accepting responsibility for those that live in the country of Scotland. It's not about because we're against somebody else or something else.
Which is also interesting because a lot of people equate Scottish independence with the Scottish National Party. So the most recent polling puts support for a yes vote at about 52%, which is still within the margin of error, but there's definitely been a significant rise in the past 2 months. And I asked this with the best of intentions. Why does the SNP poll lower than support for Scottish independence?
Maybe we're not doing our job well enough then, that's the thinking you would have from that. Because this isn't just, the SNP is the party of independence, of course it is. But there are people that support other parties. I saw a poll for those that voted in the 2019 election, and I think from my memory, I think it was 29% of those that voted Labour want Scottish independence. So people will vote for other parties. That's why you solve these questions by having a referendum. And I accept that people will vote for other parties that still want Scottish independence. I would appeal to them to vote for the SNP because I think that is the easiest way of delivering Scottish independence. But I accept that people will from time to time vote for other parties as well.
Yeah, in terms of other parties, it's clear that the SNP is not very fond of the Prime Minister. And then the question then perhaps becomes that if Scotland does become independent, a lot of analysts say that this destroys the British left. because the Labour historically, most of the gains it's exacted have been from Scotland. It's only won the majority of the English vote 3 times in the past 120 years. So realistically speaking, you're putting the Labour Party out in the cold.
Well, over the course of the last few years, we've sought to work with other progressive parties. We've made it clear that we wouldn't support the Conservatives here in the UK. It's up to the Labour Party to get its own act in own house in order in other parts of the United Kingdom. I can't do that for them. They had a disastrous election in 2019 in Scotland. They have to take their own responsibility. Why should people in Scotland be faced with a Conservative government, as we've done repeatedly over the course of the last 50 years, that we haven't voted for? The Conservatives did win an election in Scotland. It was in 1955. The Conservatives have never won an election since then. And yet, we've had to face Tory government after Tory government, and I would argue that some of the damage that Thatcher did to industrial Scotland we've never recovered from, parts of Lanarkshire, for example. So I have no desire to have a Tory government that's doing what it's doing now, taking Scotland out of the European Union against our wishes for any longer than is absolutely necessary.
The reason I ask this is that if Scottish independence happens, the success of it is contingent on some level of cooperation with the government at the centre.
Of course.
So Boris Johnson, probably more aggravated, will still be at the other side of this when Scottish independence happens. Why in that world will they give you a good deal, as it were, and not a bad deal?
It's not a question of good deal or bad deal. There's a world of difference with what has happened with the negotiations between the UK and the European Union and what happens in the situation where Scotland becomes an independent member of the European Union, because the EU is a treaty-based organisation, and that's been the trouble of the approach that the UK government has taken, because it's had so many red lines. In a funny kind of way, Scotland achieving independence doesn't have that same level of complexity that is the case with the UK and Europe. And actually, in that process, we hold a number of very strong cards. So, for example, in 2014, the Treasury made it clear that the UK debt is that, it's UK debt. Of course, we would accept our responsibilities, but we have a strong bargaining position. Nuclear weapons, we have absolutely no desire to see nuclear weapons on the decline. We want them removed. But we recognise the UK is going to have to, if it chooses to keep them, I hope they don't, but if the UK keeps them, they're going to have to build facilities somewhere else in the United Kingdom. We hold some very strong cards in these negotiations.
Yeah. What about trade then? So, for instance, Scotland, the majority of Scotland's trade, compared with everyone else combined, is greater with the United Kingdom than it is with the rest of the world. So, this is ostensibly an example where they also have strong cards as well.
Of course, but is anybody arguing that they're not going to be drinking famous grouse whiskey or eating Scottish salmon after independence?
Okay, fair enough. I feel like that's an interesting segue to a question and answer session.
Okay.
Again, men and women in equal measure, try to ask the question or make it sound like a question. Are there any questions from the audience? There we go.
Can I first? Firstly, can I say how refreshing it is to hear a fellow Scottish accent in the heart of Central London?
Where are you from?
Glasgow.
Glasgow.
Yeah. So I actually, I've had a lot of lectures here, but none as good as this.
You're not being recorded, right? Go on.
No, it's about the youth in Scotland. So, for me personally, I have not been as invested in politics as I am now. And I don't think this would have happened had the last 10 years not occurred. So, I mean, the thing that, like, the last decade doesn't come around very often.
Yeah.
So, what is it going to take for the future youth generations to be as invested as I have become in politics? Because it's like, the youth are the future of any country. They become the governing body, and they become what the future entails. So I think it's a very important thing to be investing in. So I'm not sure how it would come about in future generations.
I would just expand this question a bit more broadly. So just in 2019, there have been a series of reports about the Scottish government's either neglect or failure or limited success in with youth-related problems. So drug abuse is rising. There's been increasing times for young people seeking mental health treatment. There's been suicide has also gone off the charts over the past 2 or 3 years. The OECD is investigating the curriculum differentials within different schools in Scotland. So there's a variety of problems related to young people which seem to be somewhat related to the government in charge. So I would also ask you to deal with some of that.
My goodness, I think I was reading a Daily Mail editorial. No, but these are serious points. Let me take the first bit in terms of engagement with young people. I'm going to go back again to 2014 and the engagement, the turnout that we had in the referendum in 2014. It was pretty remarkable. And if I'm honest, I don't think, to its fullest extent anyway, we've sustained that level of engagement from young people over the course of the last few years. And I think it's really important that we do that, because I absolutely agree with you. It is about young people, it is about your future, and it grieves me that in the referendum in 2016 and the Brexit referendum that 16 and 17-year-olds were not given the vote. And actually I have to say, I think some of the most informed, if not the most informed people in the independence referendum were young people. I'm not a spring chicken, and when I look forward to the day that I'm redundant as a politician, because it should be about the contribution that young people can make. And you know, interestingly enough, when I was elected to Parliament in 2015, I became the SNP's pension spokesperson. Perhaps for some people, maybe not the most exciting portfolio to be given, but it's actually hugely important. It's hugely important for young people. And Angus Robertson, who was then the SNP leader, I said, look, I'm making this conditional on one thing. I want you to give me Mary Black, who was the youngest MP elected for hundreds of years, I think, at that time as my deputy. Because one, I saw someone that just had enormous passion, which is a great friend and a great politician. But it's partly because I wanted the future to be about young people. And actually, when I look at where we are now, Amy Callaghan, who's not that much older than Mary, was elected, and she beat Jo Swinson in East Dunbartonshire. Amy's 27 and just a brilliant talent. And we need to encourage young people to engage in politics. There are very positive reasons why Amy went on that journey. But I'm conscious that we need to create that roadmap, and we have to create the circumstances. We have to have diversity, we have to have breadth, we have to have depth, and all that entails. If we're to reflect society properly. Look, I take a lot of the things that you say.
It's not just the Daily Mail.
I know. I'm sure you wouldn't want to write for the Daily Mail, never mind read the damn thing. But
I don't know if they would hire me for something.
But no, look, I'll be candid with you. I'm ashamed of the level of drug deaths in Scotland. It is a public health crisis, and we have to address this. And my colleague Alison Thulis, one of the Glasgow MPs, has been at the forefront of this. Of course, anything we do has to be evidence-based, but we have to recognise that we have to confront this problem. You know, more broadly, there are people that say that as is put by the Daily Mail, let's use that paper again, that the SNP is not doing the day job, that we're failing in health, we're failing in education. And I have to say to you, it's simply not true. And let's take health as an example, and of course there are challenges. There's challenge for every country in the world dealing with the rise in demand for health services. But when I speak to voters, as I did in the election campaign, I meet people that have experienced the health service in Scotland. In general, they speak very warmly of their access to the service. And actually, if you look at the performance of the Scottish Health Service and you contrast it with England, with Wales and Northern Ireland, particularly when you talk about waiting times in A&E, then we outperform. If I look at satisfaction in cancer care, it's 88%. So there's an awful lot to be proud of. Do we need to do more? Do we need to be better? Yes, of course we do. On education, and a lot of this is around PISA, yes, of course, there are some challenges there. But the reason the challenges are there is because we adopted a national curriculum which was supported on a cross-party basis to give breadth and depth to the quality of education that our young people will receive. And there's a transition towards that. We're absolutely desperate, the First Minister's desperate, to deal with the attainment gap. And if I look at those from disadvantaged backgrounds in Glasgow, there's been a dramatic improvement in young people achieving 3 or more honours over the course of the last few years. Is there more to do? Yes. Is it the case that we're not delivering? Absolutely not.
Fair enough. Any more questions? We'll take you, please.
Thanks. My name is Anna Sonnstag. I study at the European Institute here. After the Brexit referendum, it turned out that actually there are many types of relations that the UK would have with the EU. As a consequence, many of the preferences that were casted in favor of leaving were actually not satisfied. Aren't you afraid that a similar period of uncertainty might follow the Scottish referendum, where actually the precise relations with the UK and with the EU are not specified in advance? Aren't you worried about that?
No. I could leave it at that, and of course I'll give you another answer. I think part of the problem was that when you had this desire that the Brexiteers had to leave Europe, but there wasn't a prospectus, there wasn't an offering, there was a kind of slogan on the side of a bus. That was it. And then it was, what's going to happen next? Theresa May comes in as the Prime Minister, she has to try and negotiate Brexit. But there was no vision, there was no philosophy. It was take back control of our money, our seas, our waters, and all the rest of it. But there was no vision as to how the UK was going to develop. It was very, very different in 2014. In our independence referendum, we had a 650-page white paper. We spelled out in detail how we saw Scotland developing as an independent country. Now, I've talked about the papers that the government is going to produce over the course of the next period. And these will be individual papers over a broad range of subjects. And the reason that we're doing that is because we want people to engage in that debate. So nobody will be under any illusion as to what the SNP is proposing. And of course, once we have independence, it's up to the voters and how they want to see that society evolve. But there'll be a very clear offering from the SNP as to the kind of society that we want to see. There'll be no mystery.
Just a brief note on these past reports. So these reports are in great detail go on about oil revenues, and the price of oil right now is 40% lower than what it was during the 2014 referendum.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if there's been a shift there in terms of the revenue base that you have in mind, or if you're sticking with a modified version of the same plans that have been released over the past 4 or 5 years.
Okay. So I don't know if you're familiar with them. I presume you will be. The Sustainable Growth Commission report that came out 2 years ago,
Yeah.
2018. And actually we see North Sea oil as a bonus, as a bounty, and we've argued that the proceeds of that should go into an infrastructure fund, into an oil fund, and they will be separate from day-to-day accounting that we would have for revenue and spending. So we simply don't count on any of the revenues from North Sea oil, and partly for 2 reasons in some respects. One is because the big years, the good years are very much behind us as far as that's concerned. I would concede that. But secondly, for the reason that you say, and we see it again over the last few days, it's a volatile commodity, and of course the revenues from that will therefore fluctuate, and your spending should not therefore be dependent on the revenues that come from the North Sea.
Fair enough. Any more questions? We'll take I don't want to be mean to you, but we'll take the gentleman in the back. Yeah.
We're gonna wait for a second.
Thank you. So what I wanted to ask is, well, given the current rise in the independence movement in Scotland, what is the SNP stance and your personal stance on current independence?
On I'm sorry, what independence?
Kurdish independence.
Kurdish independence. Well, I think the way the Kurds have been treated, particularly recently, given the part they played in the Syrian conflict, is an absolute disgrace. I think the way that President Trump turned his back on the Kurds, I mean, it's a strong word, but it's almost unforgivable. Now, I mean, the point we kind of addressed earlier, that it is the right of any peoples to self-determination. Of course, the issue of the Kurds is complex given the multi-countries that the Kurds currently live in, but that general principle of the Kurds having a right to self-determination as a principle is one I would support.
Just broadly, question about international organizations. So the one thing that the United Kingdom is very good at is membership. Be it of the United Nations Security Council, the G8, there's a motley of organizations that assumes a leadership role in. If independence happens, very briefly, how do you think Scotland deals with the repercussions of what is ostensibly a reduction in international influence?
Does anybody really think the UK has a position of leadership in the Security Council of the United Nations? Maybe, can I have a show of hands? Does anybody really think the UK shows leadership in the Security Council?
But surely the comparative is not between the UK and the US and China, the comparative is between the UK and Scotland.
I don't mind you put it that way, but I'm being serious as well, because in many respects I would actually let's go back to the first Gulf War. And I think in many respects there was a missed opportunity, because I think there was the opportunity for the US, Russia and China to work together to make sure that the UN had proper teeth. And for a whole series of reasons that opportunity has been missed. I mean, look, in terms of what the UN ought to be doing, look at what's happening in Syria at the moment. You can talk about a variety of other places. The UN does not have the authority to execute the mandate that it's supposed to have. Now, let me take a specific example. In the 2015-17 Parliament, I co-sponsored a motion with a Conservative MP, Fiona Bruce, and it was about the persecution of the Yazidis and the Christians. And I think there's prima facie evidence that there's been genocide that has been affected on these people. And the motion that we had in front of Parliament was a request for the United Kingdom to take this case to the Security Council of the United Nations. I was gobsmacked when the minister that responded for the government said that they couldn't take this to the Security Council of the United Nations because the Russians and the Chinese will more than likely veto it. Now, the idea that you don't raise a matter of such importance because you think somebody else might veto it is an abrogation of responsibility. Now, Scotland will be a small country, we are a small voice, but with other progressive countries, we would want to make sure in international affairs that we accepted our responsibilities. And if I may, let me say just a wee bit more on that. We've gone from the situation on the back of the election that we've gone from 35 to 47 MPs. You might ask why I'm raising that. For me, it's actually very significant because being the third party in Westminster with 35 MPs is actually pretty tough because you have to shadow every government department. And I've got a little bit more capacity than I had before, but also that sole focus of Parliament in some respects over the course of the last few years has been on Brexit. And I do think there's a particular opportunity, and if I may say so, a responsibility of the third party in Westminster to focus on international matters and to focus on matters of human rights and genocide, just as I said. So one of the things I've done in a reshuffle that I did, I've appointed someone specifically with responsibility for international human rights. And we have very limited time in Parliament for debates, but I'm absolutely determined that we will use that time to focus on persecution. And I think we've got to continue to raise the issues of what has happened with the Holocaust, with what happened in Srebrenica, with what happened in Rwanda, but to reflect on the fact, and it's sad to say, that in many parts of the world, whether it's with the Uyghurs, whether it's what has happened in Myanmar, that is still genocide, that is still persecution of peoples that happen in this world. And and we have a responsibility as Democrats to raise these issues and make sure there's a spotlight on these issues.
Fair enough. Any more questions? Take it in the back.
Yeah, so a lot of the talk about independence is about the economic situation that Scotland would face. So in the hypothetical that independence was to occur, I guess my question is about how you would envisage the political landscape clearing. So I think we can probably all agree that the SNP's biggest policy is independence for Scotland. If that is then achieved, does that mean that Scotland effectively has to become a sort of democratic form of a one-party state in which the SNP is the only state? Well, given that there is only one other party in Scotland, which is the Greens, who support independence, in the case of independence, would all other parties then become redundant and the SNP would become, in some way, the one party people could vote for? Or would it actually mean that the SNP as a party is now itself completely redundant because you've achieved independence and it's made to go? So what do you see the future in the situation that if Scotland were to become independent? Do you think you've got yourself a job for life, or do you think you're out of one forever?
I would just add to this question briefly, and so I also saw some opinion polling from 2017 and 2018, and the people were asked about generally why they're voting for the SNP, and there was stuff about independence and healthcare and all of that. But part of it was also, this is the only stable non-coalition government we can elect. So this is already an issue without an independent Scotland. Does it get worse?
Mighty me, the pair of you. But it's almost, you know, I can paraphrase this, it's your fault that you've actually got a party which is electable and the rest of them are a bunch of, well, whatever. But if I may, because you said hypothetical, actually there is no hypothetical because Scotland will become independent. I firmly believe it. I understand why you make that point, because in some cases, some senses, the SNP has been in government for 12 years. It's a long time. And to get 45% of the vote, 45% of the vote in a government that's not doing the day job is quite, I don't mean that as a dignity, is quite extraordinary. You know, in a funny kind of way, well, one is I want the SNP to be in government when we win independence, because I would like us to be able to put in place the proposition that we bring forward for independence. But in some respects, and I would say arguably, particularly for the Labour Party, that the best thing that could happen to it is Scotland becoming independent. Because it would create that opportunity for the Labour Party and others then to develop a policy programme for an independent Scotland. Now, Katrina, when it comes to personal ambition, I don't have any. And if the First Minister wants me to do something, then I would look at it. But when Scotland becomes independent, I'm quite happy to retire back to my craft. I don't want a job for life. I've come to this late on. I'm desperate to see Scotland independent and for us to deliver on the things that I've talked about. But for me, I will then be able to sit back, have a dram, and enjoy watching younger people taking this modern nation forward.
Fair enough. Questions? Let's just not annoy you very much. This gentleman, please. Yeah.
So I guess I'm going to ask a question as a hypothetical on the
Not a
negatives.
hypothetical one.
This is the LSE. We have not those. Go.
I guess because I come from, okay, let's just say independence referendum turns out negative in the end. Hypothetical. Now, I come from Canada where they've had two.
Where are you from in Canada?
I'm from Ottawa,
Okay.
but right across the river they had
Yeah.
two referendums for separation. Both were unsuccessful. But within the frame of federalism, now it's different from obviously the subnational government arrangements and devolution of powers here, but there's an emphasis on, I guess, an entrenchment within a written constitution of separation of powers, but also an equalization payment scheme that allows for a somewhat equitable growth among all regions. That sort of a model, could it serve as at least something for the SNP to push for in the event of in the event of a failure of a referendum, sort of as a contingency plan? And is it even feasible to begin with?
Well, let's take the second bit, the last bit. I think the answer sadly is no. And look, there are people that I know in the UK, Professor Jeffries at Emory, what was at Emory University, was vice principal. He's now gone to York as a principal. He, I think, was one of the leading academics in the UK that argued for a federal structure. It's for others to do that. I don't believe that that meets our needs. I think we've got to have the self-confidence to become an independent country. I firmly believe we will win that referendum. I accept hypothetical, but maybe some circumstances that others think that's more challenging. And I put it that way. But I believe we will win. I believe people will want to complete the powers of the Parliament, because that's very much the way that I see it. I think in many respects, and of course the Quebec experience is very different. The issue of language and culture and so on, which doesn't really apply in anything like the same way. Because remember, one of the things about what we're arguing for, and it's very demonstrative about the people that live in Scotland and the contribution that they make to society, how we see ourselves. It's a civic nationalism which is pretty different from the situation in Quebec, for example. It's about that inclusiveness. It's about how you create that broader consensus. But I understand that, and when you look at the Canadian experience, that experience of federalism that we talk about, that of course there's more protection for the individual provinces that certainly doesn't apply in the UK. And you've got this kind of strange structure, because you've got, for these purposes, let's say there's 4 nations. I know it's different before Owen tells me in Northern Ireland, but let's call them four nations that are part of the UK state. But there isn't mutual respect that exists within all of that. It is very much, as we see just now, that the UK Parliament in Westminster will be able to determine what happens in the other places. You know, there's an important point in all of that, because through the Brexit process, I got thrown out of Parliament in 2018 because I stood up against what was a power grab from the Westminster government, and it was as a consequence of what was happening with Brexit. Because when you look at the establishment of the Scottish Parliament, if you look at the Scotland Act, it defined in that act matters that were reserved. And then along comes Brexit, along comes the UK government and say, well, there's these powers in fishing and environment and agriculture, we're going to take them to Westminster. Well, no, you can't, because by the Scotland Act, these are defined as devolved competences. And what was extraordinary is that you have a situation that if Westminster seeks to legislate in areas which are devolved, then the Sewell Convention applies, and the Sewell Convention, the principle behind it, is that devolved administrations have to give legislative consent. And of course the Scottish Parliament said, well, you can't do this. And the fundamental point about all of this was that these powers were not voted on by the SNP or by the Scottish Parliament. They were voted on by the Scottish people that had voted in a referendum in 1997 to establish a Parliament. And Westminster simply couldn't understand why we were upset and why we had to put down a marker and say, you cannot do this, because you're interfering with the devolution settlement without the consent of the Scottish Parliament. Now that rolled on, because when we had the withdrawal agreement bill that became the Act just a few short weeks ago, it was done without the consent of the Scottish Parliament, of the Welsh Assembly and the Northern Ireland Assembly. So you've got Westminster that's saying, well, we're supreme. We're quite prepared to ignore the convention that exists, and we're quite simply prepared to ignore the wishes of the Scottish, the Welsh and the Northern Ireland Parliaments. That's pretty remarkable, and it couldn't happen in the Canadian context.
Fair enough. Any other questions? Let's spread this out.
Okay, so in any normal circumstances, we might think that a reasonable, moderate, well-advised leader in Westminster, by which I mean leader of the UK government in Westminster, would acquiesce to growing public support for a second referendum in Scotland. However, I'm not sure that any of those three words apply to the current incumbent at number 10. Now, he may well be very aware that the more he is belligerent about this, the more support will grow. But ultimately, he holds the card, right? So what is it that you think means he will ultimately, in the next 5 years, grant a second referendum?
Well, thank you. And again, it's a good question. It's the right question to ask. And by the way, I hope it's not 5 years. I hope it's considerably shorter than that. In the end, because sense will have to prevail. And I anticipate the team was going to say no when the First Minister wrote a letter before the end of last year. And I'm not giving up, by the way. We can have a referendum this year. Let's wait and see. But I've stressed the importance of public opinion. Now, if we roll on to 2021, and if the polls are correct, and we win that election, is the Prime Minister really going to say that he's going to time after time ignore the express views and wishes of the people in Scotland that have voted in a democratic election? I've described the process towards a referendum, actually in terms of winning independence, as unstoppable, and I believe that. And in the end, I mean, the Scots are a fairly thorough bunch, and whether people actually agree with us on independence, today, one of the things they don't like is being told you can't do it. It's about the worst thing that Boris Johnson can do. So, let him try, but this is an argument we will win. And ultimately there will be agreement on transferring that power to the Scottish Parliament for a referendum.
Just a small addendum to that question. So the SNP broadly wants a referendum, but there are different opinions within the party on some level about what this referendum might look like. And a lot of it's colored by the Prime Minister's insistence to reject the calls for a formal legal referendum. There's talks of a wildcat referendum, which is to do it just without parliamentary consent. There's talks about doing a non-binding consultative referendum. So where do you stand on those different options on the policy menu outside of the legal referendum?
So this is where people talk about Plan B, it's often referred to when you're talking about. And I would simply say to people in Scotland, and those that may talk about an alternative view on this, we, in the election campaign at the end of last year, fought on the basis of Scotland's right to choose. We had an extraordinary result. We weren't that far away from winning a couple of other seats. I'd say to everybody that Plan A is working. Why would you have a Plan B or C, D, E, F, and G?
Seems like a prudent option in life, no?
Sorry?
It seems like a prudent thing to do in life, to have a plan B. Plan A doesn't work out.
I accept that. So I concede that. But you wouldn't necessarily say what your Plan B is today.
So for instance, for these kids, it was Oxford. Now there they are.
Luckily, Plan A worked. So, and the First Minister has said, of course, we will, in extremis, look at the options which are available to us. The plan may not work.
Fair enough. Any other questions?
Unfortunately, the mic has stopped working, so you can hold it for theatrics if you want. If you could just speak up, maybe.
Yeah, use your outdoor voice. Any questions? Could we take the lady over here, please? Go for it.
So I was just wondering, theoretically assuming that the referendum will be successful, I was wondering what sort of EU member would you see Scotland as? So what many people would call a full member of the Union? Would you want to be part of the Eurozone? Would you try to be part of Schengen? And then what would Scotland's vision for the EU be? Would you strive to deep integration? I guess what many people would think here of would be an European army sort of policy, or would you try to expand the European project? There we've seen the recent cases of Albania and North Macedonia being rejected. So I was just wondering what assuming that the referendum will be successful and you'll be a part of the EU, what would Scotland's role be within the Union?
And specifically about monetary policy, the Sustainable Growth Report that you mentioned from 2018 did speak of Scotland retaining the pound for what was called a potentially extended period. So the frame given was 5 to 10 years, but they said could be less, could be more. So perhaps mentioning that as well in your response.
Okay, thank you. So What we have said is, so let's currency is an integral part of this, what we have said is that we will keep the pound. We will establish a central bank, but we will not do that through a formal monetary union with the United Kingdom. So what was talked about in 2014 doesn't apply. So, as you will all know, I don't have to tell all of you, that's something which is absolutely permissible. You can do that. You don't need anyone's authority to do that. What I would say is we meet the entry requirement of the European Union through the formation of a central bank that we will have. Of course, there is a requirement as a principle that you join the euro, that you give an indication to do so. But please remember that in doing that, that is conditional upon you entering the exchange rate mechanism for a 2-year period, and that is entirely voluntary. And of course, you have to meet the Maastricht, as a principle, you have to meet the Maastricht criteria for that. So we can't be forced into the euro against our will, and our view is that we will retain the pound sterling until such time, as you say, that we meet a series of economic tests which would result in a proposal from the central bank to the parliament as to whether or not we should have our own currency. As you will know, what the report also states, and has been accepted by the SNP, that if we have our own currency, then just as happens with the Hong Kong and the US dollar, it will be pegged on a one-to-one basis to the pound sterling. But that will be done on the basis of having met several tests. It will be done on the basis of having adequate reserves at that point as well. As far as Europe is concerned in terms of philosophy, let's take, when you talk about a European army, we've expressed a very clear desire to be a member of NATO, and that is where that pooling should take place. Of course, there's cooperation that can happen with European friends and partners, but we have no desire as a principle to see a separate European army. There is no need for that to take place. The European Union, nobody's argued, we would never argue that the European Union is perfect, it's not. But what you have got are 27 member states that work on a collective basis, and the ability to participate in that is something that we eagerly look forward to doing. And again, there's that contrast on that desire to pool and share sovereignty where appropriate, in the way that the UK currently works when it ignores the sovereign rights of the people of Scotland. So we see it very differently. We would enter into the European Union with enthusiasm to play our part. But when you talk about the integration that you've identified, we don't see the need for that. We see the opportunities to, bluntly, the opportunities that we see through Horizon, that we see through Erasmus, the opportunities of the 4 freedoms that we talk about are the key elements of the attractions, and of being EU citizens, because that is important to us. There's a long, actually, if you look at Scotland's history before we lost our independence in 1707, there was a long experience of partnership with Europe, whether that was with the Baltics, whether it was with Benelux, with France, and so on and so forth. Actually, to the extent that the Dutch granted us a trading port in the southern part of the Netherlands that we had to give up our independence in 1707. And it's interesting, if you look at it the other way, if you go to parts of Scotland, and particularly go to Edinburgh, and you look around, you will see significant evidence of European architecture, just as an example. And in fact, when you look at our academic sector, and you look at our 4 historic universities, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, and St Andrews, they were very much based on the model of Leiden. So there's been that long history of cooperation and working with our European friends and partners that we wish to get back again.
Any other questions? So I can just take questions now. I don't have to wait for the mic, so I will not exercise this question. Please, go for it.
So, as a Spaniard myself, I'd say that one of the traits of Catalan nationalist politicians is their radicalization and I'd say the disdain, and that's too soft a word, that they feel towards unionist politicians. So my question to you is, do you have in the House of Commons good, close unionist friends with whom you would go to the pub, for example?
Are you friends with unionists?
Am I friend? Look, I don't define people by being unionist or nationalist, I have a desire for Scotland to complete its journey, but I would never make a judgment on someone as a friend. I mean, of course, sometimes it's easier when you have people that share the same political philosophy as you. My wife is a fervent member of the Scottish National Party. I can't imagine being in a union and a partnership where you perhaps don't share these views in a broad sense, at least anyway. Look, I will argue against the government. I'll explain why I believe that the government acts against our interests, but I would never extend any personal animosity to anyone that takes a different view. Would I sit down and have a cup of tea or a drink or dinner with someone of different views? Of course I would.
So Boris Johnson said, you wouldn't mind breaking bread with Boris Johnson?
I mean, you always have to be. We're all citizens of the planet. We all have to work together.
That's a very low bar.
There are a number of Conservative politicians I've known for a long time. I can probably say to you that there's one ex-colleague that sits on the government benches, and in fact there's an ex-client of mine. I used to work in the city, and you'll probably laugh when I tell you this, and I'm sure you won't mind if I say this either, but Jacob Rees-Mogg used to be a client of mine. Can I have a relationship with people that have different political views? People shouldn't be small-minded. People should be prepared to have, the phrase I used earlier, they should be able to have a generosity of spirit and see people as human beings.
Right, any other questions? I'll take you in the back, please. Yeah.
So you just said you used to be in the city, now you're working in policy.
All right, here we go. Right, I can do
But also you said that, you know, part of the reason you're in politics is it's for Scottish independence, and the dream afterwards is just a Cincinnatus-esque style, just go home to the farm once institutions. So
it's cross, not a farm.
So you're sitting to a front of a room of LSE students who probably all plan to go to the city after this. Do you think
want to
that,
go to the city?
That's statistically true.
do you think that do you think that politics is the best means for securing change? And do you think, because you mentioned you came, do you think that it is a game that is best going into early? Or do you think that we should first walk down to bank?
Wow. How long have we got? That sounds like a topic of a debate. I mean, it's a really good question, and I'm not sure there's a straightforward answer to that. I can perhaps look at my own experience. I worked in the city for quite a long time, and I'm not going to deny, in fact I'd be pretty damn stupid if I did, that I really enjoyed my time in the city. I was an analyst. A different world then to the one that you're inhabiting today, because in those days, almost goes far as to say that to be an analyst was a respectful occupation. Almost seems like a ridiculous thing to say now. But when I did it, I was a country analyst, and that doesn't exist anymore, so I covered the Netherlands, which meant as an analyst that you're covering Royal Dutch, Axel, Heineken, Unilever, you name it, from large companies to small companies, and the privilege that I took from that to be able to do that. And I think I would argue that my ability to do a job as a member of Parliament, based on the skills that I hopefully developed in my professional career, are of some help. Now, by the same token, I mentioned Mary, I mentioned Amy, the way that they can contribute to Parliament. I don't think it's wholly necessary always to have gone down that road. I would argue, I think it helps me. I think you've got to determine your own future. I suppose what I would say to you is that, I stated the bleeding obvious, that life is not a dress rehearsal, this is it. And of course you want to make a contribution to society. You've got to enjoy what you do as well. Of course you've got to give something back. But hopefully that's made through making positive choices as to how you see your future. The city today is a very different place from the one I worked in, and I'll not make any judgment on the way that it reforms. And the city, of course, has made an enormous contribution over time to the wealth of the United Kingdom. But you've got to make your own judgment about how you develop your own skill set, how you use that to best effect. So whether that means you go into city, whether you do something which is even more productive, or whether you see yourself having a future in politics, only you can make that determination.
For those who are curious, the applications for the Scottish Civil Service open up in May. I just want to put this out there. Any other questions? Any women from the audience with a question? No. Go for it.
Yeah, just a quick one. When Scotland becomes independent, and you notice I've dropped the hypothetical here.
Excellent. I'm liking this.
Would the grandson of a Scotsman be able to get a shiny burgundy Scottish passport? and straight off burgundy, just being able to go around.
Yeah, no, I know. You know, I'm less precious of what the colour of these things are, but I very much. I personally want to remain a citizen of the European Union. Look, based on the prospectus we had in 2014, that was very much the offering that those with the kind of rights you outlined, grandparents having come from Scotland, are very much welcome. But you know, let me put it in a kind of broader context. There's a phrase which has been used in the past that we're not full up, and that's demonstrably the case. So we want people to come and make a contribution to life in Scotland. And actually, when you talk about politics in the UK and the left and all the rest of it, I find it gratifying that many people from England and from other places as well have expressed a desire to come and want to live and work in Scotland. So, in short, you're very welcome. Can I tell a quick story? So, in the election campaign in 2019, I was out in Portree with a group of workers. There was an American guy actually living in Skye, and he had a friend he wanted to introduce me to. And this chap was actually coming out canvassing for us. He was living in Fife. He was from Somerset, and I have to say I was pretty gobsmacked with the conversation I had with him, because he said, can I tell you how I ended up living in Scotland? And I'm going to tell me. He said, that day that you got thrown out of Parliament. Now, by the way, that was quite a day for us anyway, because we increased our membership by 10,000. I guess he must have been one of them. He said, I decided I wanted to come and live in Scotland. He's a wood turner. So he said, that was it. I put my house on the market and I moved to Fife and I'm here. That's quite a remarkable story, why somebody made that decision to come and live in Scotland. And now he's campaigning for independence.
Very nice. Any other questions? Take you in the back. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Joshua from Singapore. I think you'll agree we have quite a bit of experience in separation and independence. You talk about plans and you talk about white paper, and it's certainly admirable, but I think the past few years of Brexit have shown us that negotiations can be a very messy process. How would Scotland approach negotiations, or how would your approach differ from your colleagues in number 10 right now?
Massively. Theresa. What can you say about Theresa? Let's be kind, she was public spirited, she is public spirited. The way the UK tied itself in knots over the red lines was the real problem. That was the issue. We will enter into negotiations with the United Kingdom with the right spirit. Of course, we'll be firm. We'll make sure that we represent our interests. But we will do it on the basis of having a very clear plan. Now, when you go through all the speeches that Theresa May made over a long period of time, one example, Lancaster House, there was never any real proposal that the Conservatives had, the government had. The only time that she had a firm proposal was when she pulled her cabinet together at Chequers. If you remember what came out of that, it looked as a principle that where she was trying to take the government was something I would broadly define as being consistent with the single market customs union. You could argue about where the ultimate destination was going to be. And she faced down the Brexiteers at that point. She lost David Davis, she lost Who's the other one?
Boris.
That's right. Forgotten. They walked out of cabinet. Actually, if you remember, they walked out of cabinet on the Sunday and the Monday. The Chequers meeting was the Thursday and Friday. I saw David Davis before he went to Chequers, and there was some suggestion that he would be walking out. And I did say to him, I said, David, if you're going to walk out of cabinet, don't do it at Chequers. It's a long, long walk up the drive. But anyway, to come back to the point, that was the first time, and that was very late on in the process, that the Conservative government was outlining any kind of wish list as to what it wanted. The one thing I will say that was extraordinary about that, because we had the trade and the customs bill coming to Parliament the following week, and the ERG members put down wrecking amendments in effect. And having seen off the ERG, the Brexiteers in Cabinet, she then did a 180-degree turn and accepted these amendments from the ERG. Why? I don't know. But that fundamentally weakened our negotiating position with the EU. And I think that's why the UK ended up in the mess that it did for so long, because it wasn't clear to the EU what exactly, on the one hand, that the UK was seeking to achieve. But within that, if there was to be an agreement between the UK and the EU, how Theresa May's government could deliver. And that was the reason for the problems that she had. So there isn't a parallel that runs into any future negotiations for Scotland.
Any other questions? If you like this, go for it.
So basically, I'm from China, and I'm personally kind of the sympathizer of Scottish independence movement, although top 10, Scottish platform as a pledge. So my question is, so given your background as a kind of a crofter in Highland, and it is apparently that whether people from lowland or Highland, they are voting for Scottish independence. However, they have different kind of different causes or kind of thoughts behind Scottish independence that they're voting for. So there are different versions across the people. So how do you kind of fulfill those various interests after hypothetical Scottish independence?
Thank you. You know, that's a really, really good question. And again, I'm going to be candid with you. So you look at some of the issues that we face, the accusation that the UK is very much centralised in London. There's a challenge for us. Let's be honest about it. That we must not do the same in Scotland as has happened in the United Kingdom. So of course, government's in Edinburgh, Edinburgh's our capital, it's where I originally came from. But one of the things I speak to colleagues about, and I think it's really important, is that I am, first and foremost, I am a Highland MP. And the challenges that are faced in the Highlands are very, very different from the situation in Edinburgh, Glasgow, or elsewhere. And I mean, I've spoken about the population in Scotland, how we haven't grown over the course of the last 100 years. But the story of the Highlands is one of real challenge. And actually, I look at the loss of young people. I don't mean going back 200 years to the clearances. I mean the lack of economic opportunity and people having to leave. And there's a sadness about the glens having been emptied. And if I look at the Isle of Skye, and the Isle of Skye is actually bigger than London. There's about 11,000 people that live there now. Actually, if you went back to the 60s, there was only 6,000. So something has actually happened. But I recognise the responsibility I have got with colleagues, Highland MPs that are here and MSPs that are in the Scottish Parliament, that we have to speak up for the Highlands. I want to see not just a place which is a tourist destination, important though that is. I want to see a place which is a living, breathing, working place. Now I'm proud of, if I take Fort William, which is the biggest town in my constituency, it's an industrial place. We have the last aluminium smelter in the United Kingdom as an example. And I'm so desperate to see jobs created in that place. And I lead the SNP at Westminster, but I'll never forget the privilege that there is to represent the people of the Highlands and Islands. It's very, very different from being an MP in Edinburgh, Glasgow, London. I'll maybe just expand on this if I may. So as an example, I do surgeries in 32 places, and my constituency stretches from Achill-the-Booey, which is way north of Liverpool, and goes right down to Glencoe. It's 180 miles in length. It goes from the west coast of Scotland to the east coast of Scotland. It's 12,000 square kilometres. It's the same size as Northern Ireland that has 18 constituencies, with a lot of distinct communities, a lot of local newspapers. And actually it's interesting, I mentioned Achill-the-Booey, but there's a woman that came to Parliament from Achill-the-Booey a couple of weeks ago, and she said to me, I met you when you came to Achill-the-Booey, and I said, yes, I remember meeting you. And I said, that meeting in Achill-the-Booey, which is a tiny village, was extraordinary because almost the entire village turned up for a surgery. And I don't know how many people in this room here know who their MP is. Maybe you're more politically aware, maybe you do to a large extent. But I can tell you, it's got nothing to do with me, because it wouldn't matter if it was me or someone else. People in these communities in the Highlands know who their MP is, because actually they feel a sense of ownership. They own you. You are there to represent them. And I understand the obligation I've got to represent them, to speak up for them. And, you know, when I think of these small communities and the small islands I've got, Rugmuck, and Canna, the small isles, for example, so I go there over 2 days, I visit the 4 islands, and it's extraordinary when you go there, because they are there to meet you, they're there to greet you, and they want to have a discussion about the big issues of the day. And never make the assumption, or I'm sure you wouldn't, that people in these remote communities that are engaged in crofting or fishing or whatever else it might be are not engaged with what's going on in the world, because I can tell you they absolutely are. And they'll watch the Parliament channel or watch the BBC or CNN or whatever else it might be. But that engagement you get in these communities is extraordinary. The last point I'll make is that there was a study which was done by the University of the Highlands, by Highlands and Islands Enterprise, and 2 years ago, for the first time, the majority of young people leaving school were staying in the Highlands and Islands, either to go to college, university or work. And one of the great advances that we have is we have the University of the Highlands and Islands. And actually in Skye we have 2 colleges, because we have the Gaelic College in the south end of the island, and we have the West Highland College as well. And so I can see it changing. I can see young people seeing a future for themselves. Crofting is a very important part of it, by the way, because it's a foundation stone of our culture. You don't find many people that are full-time crofters, they'll do other things. But that connection you have is very, very important, that comes with that experience of being engaged in crafting. And so I thank you for the question, because I think it was a very good question.
Thank you. Because I actually am very interested in some Highland cultures and crafting and fishing. I've been to Inverness, and I've been to St Andrews, all those places. I'm fascinated by the Scottish culture.
Well, you know, it is important, and you see, when we talk about being an open society and inviting people to come in and to help shape our future, there also is the importance of knowing where you've come from. And the interesting thing about when you're engaged in crofting, and these things evolve, they change, but often these crofts have been in the same family for hundreds of years. And so that perspective that gives you, that link that gives you, is actually quite important.
Any other questions? By the way, for anyone who wants to study marine biology, the universities in the Highlands are some of the best in the world.
Absolutely.
Just a random plug for the university. Any other questions? We'll just take the last 2 questions. I'll take you first, actually. Sorry, just 1 second. Yeah.
So I'm from Northern Ireland. There's been a bit of talk about that.
Yeah.
And one of the central things in issues of independence and the island of Ireland is the idea of language and culture, and how that's sort of very divisive. So how would you see Scottish independence having an impact on language and culture?
Well, I'm glad, again, thank you for that, and I'm aware of the importance of this in Northern Ireland and how divisive this has been as an issue. And I have to say it grieves me, because the thing I'd say about language, and in our case the Gaelic language, or whether you were talking about Lannons or Scots as well, or Ulster Scots in your context, is that language belongs to all of us. And the one thing I'm particularly pleased about when I look at Gaelic is that it's something that people in the Parliament in Edinburgh in general do not make political capital out of. And there's a cross-party consensus across ourselves, across the Conservatives, across Labour, across the Liberals and Greens, that all of us have got a responsibility to support the Gaelic language. Now, you would argue that some terrible things were done to the Gaeltacht in the past, but that is the past. People were forbidden from teaching the language, for example, in schools, but look, that's history. The point is that all of us recognise the rich diversity of society and culture. Gaelic is very much part of our history. I live in Skye, which I don't have the language, but it was very much a Gaelic-speaking island. But it's really interesting when you look and you see what has happened over the course of the last few years. So just to give you an example, that there are examples in Glasgow, in Fort William, in Portree and Skye, of Gaelic-only schools. And this is a kind of a recent development. It was the case in the past that you had what they call Gaelic medium education, so you would have an English language school and you would have a Gaelic part to that. Has brought many advantages, but of course, if you're in an environment where the children are going outside, and some people can speak Gaelic and some can't, then the default language is going to become English. And you need to create self-confidence in the language, so the ability to deliver Gaelic-only schools has been very important. And actually, in all the cases that I've talked about, the success of these primary schools, Glasgow's actually right through to 18, but in the other cases, the primary schools has been phenomenal. And when the Gaelic school opened in Portree, which was only 2 years ago, the number of children that went to the Gaelic school was higher than the number of children that went to English language primary school. Broadford, which is in the south end of the island, I was just there last week, 75% of the children in the nursery side of things are in the Gaelic side of things. So there's a revival which is taking place at that level. And what's interesting is it's not just those that have a historic connection with the island, it's not those that are Indigenous people. Many people that have come to live in Skye wish to participate in this as well. There's a homogeneity that comes with the developments that are taking place, and it's something to be absolutely proud of. You can never force language down anyone's throat. It should be there to experience for those that wish to do so. We've got some way to go. A big job to do to make sure that the language thrives. We're down to about 80,000 speakers of Gaelic today, but we must create the circumstances that allow this to be a living, breathing, working language. Final point out of that is that we have a television and radio station, so we have BBC Alapa and we have Radio Nangao. And actually BBC Alapa, on relatively meagre resources, produces some excellent programming, and the reach of the station is way beyond the number of people that speak the language. Last point I'll make actually, is there anybody here familiar with the Scottish rock band Runrig? No? Okay.
Is Katrina in there?
Only from Loch Lomond though.
Okay, right. So you're a bit young to remember Runrig and their heyday, that just disbanded. But this was the biggest band in Scotland for decades. And when they played Loch Lomond, where I think there was 40,000 people at that concert, the live concert they played in Loch Lomond, but they sung half in Gaelic, half in English, and they were an absolute phenomena in countries like Germany and Denmark. Don't ask me why, but massively successful. I love telling stories. I'm going to tell you a story. So there was a German woman lives in Skye. This has been recorded. I probably shouldn't say her name. So she had a weekly radio program on the local radio station in Skye, Coolin FM, but she only ever played Runrig songs every week, which even I thought was a bit much. But I remember speaking to a client in the city in Munich, and a guy called Morton, I'll say something, or Morton Fisher, I said to Martin, this incredible story about this German woman living in Skye that plays nothing but Rundgren. Yes, he says, that's not so unusual, I have all their albums. And I just think, so when you talk about culture and language and how sometimes these things can be transported across boundaries, it's quite interesting. But if anyone's not listened to Rundgren, the best album is Heartland, and I would thoroughly recommend it. And actually, last point of that, last point is the keyboard player.
Are they a client by any chance?
Eh?
Are they a client or is this just...
No, it's sad to say that it's banded. But the keyboard player, for most of their experience, was a guy called Pete Wishart, who's now the SNP MP for Perth. He was a keyboard player.
Fair enough. Before we take this last question, thank you for your persistence. What I will just say is that after the question and answer session wraps up, our president will come up and give a series of thanks to who came in, after which we will have what the LSE corporate culture calls networking time. So all this means in a nutshell is that you can approach Mr. Blackford, talk to him, chat with him, take selfies with him, don't rush the stage, we call security. So just if you have a 15-minute space, you can come up and chat with him privately. Having said that, last question please.
So thank you for coming. It's been really enlightening to shed light on your perspective on that. My main question is, you said that people will be sovereign in independent Scotland. And at the moment, as you said, in the current system we have a crown of parliament, the parliamentary sovereignty. So are you intending in a constitution to retain monarchy, or are you planning to set up a different? So how would a constitution generally look like in Scotland? So things like monarchy, PR, Scottish Lords, for instance, what would happen to them? Is it going to be codified or not? And on a lighter note, who's behind the stunts that you keep doing in Westminster?
Stunts?
Because I have a feeling, well, the European anthem.
Okay, I'll cover that.
And you're walking out from
No, I got thrown out. I didn't walk out. Right, okay. The Queen will remain as head of state. That won't change. The one thing I would say to you, this issue of the people being sovereign is not something that we believe should happen post-independence. It's something that we demonstrably state is already the case. I mentioned the claim of right because that's a historic position, but I referenced the Declaration of Arbroath as being the founding principle behind that, and of course the legal action that took place in 1952. That was a guy, when I said it was McCormick versus the Crown, he was actually the rector of Glasgow University, and I'm going off on a tangent a bit, but all these actions that took place, one of the starting point for that in many respects was the recovery of the Stone of Destiny, which was recovered back from Westminster Abbey. But the principal figure behind that was a guy called Ian Hamilton, who was actually a QC, and it was quite an interesting story in this whole right. So, stunts, as you call them. So, that Tuesday evening, when government pushed through the Withdrawal Act and these powers were stripped from the Scottish Parliament, it happened late on. And believe it or not, if you look at Hansard, it was a 15-minute debate. We weren't formally allowed to speak. I was able to intervene on the minister, but the minister rushed us through. That evening, I had 3 conversations. One with a chap called Michael Russell, who's the Scottish minister responsible for negotiating with the UK government over Brexit. He's a mild-mannered individual. He was actually in Dublin at the time, and he was all from manning the barricades, and it was quite extraordinary. Mike is not that type of character. I spoke to the First Minister, and she said, Ian, you have to do something. So that was helpful. I spoke to my wife, and she said, Ian, if you don't do something, don't come home. Now you can laugh, but the phone was put down. So, I knew she was serious. So, we have a team of people that gather together when we prepare for Prime Minister's questions. Owen, sitting across there, I can see him laughing as one of those. So we met very early the next morning, and I'd worked out this idea that I could use this procedural device to move a motion that this House settle private. Actually, Kirsty, who's my deputy, had already checked that with one of the clerks, so we knew that it was permissible. Various things. It was a fairly hectic morning, so there were a lot of things going on. And I came back in, and it's fair to say that my chief whip was not in favour, and he'd actually engaged the previous chief whip, which was Pete Wishart, the guy I just mentioned, saying to me, Ian, you can't do this. This won't work. We went back up to my room. It was about 10 to 12 at this point. Prime Minister's question is just about to start. And I had two of my advisors saying, well, we think we should, and they were saying, well, we think we shouldn't. And then you have to make your own mind up, and that's great. So I went down and I took a seat in the front bench, and I sat beside two members of Parliament, Neil Gray and Chris Law, who's the big guy with the ponytail. And Chris would always say, what are you going on today? And I showed them, and they both went, and I thought, I don't believe this. I've got about 4 MPs that know what I'm doing, and they're all saying not to do it. Now, I don't hear very well, and I'd received a message on my phone that I'd always ignored. Sitting behind me was an MP called Gavin Ewan, sitting behind Gavin, who was Mary. And Gavin's tapped me on the shoulder and said, look at Mary, and Mary's waving her phone in the air saying, look at your phone, look at your phone. And it was a message from the First Minister, and it simply said, go for it. so we did, and I think, I hope the then Speaker would not begrudge me saying this. I think he made a bit of a mess of it, frankly. Obviously decided he was throwing me out, so that was fine. But most of the group didn't know what was going on. I'm not even very sure I knew what was actually going on. And I thought, right, okay, I'm having to leave Parliament. By the way, you leave the estate, and they actually put 2 policemen on the office door to make sure they didn't come back. But as I left the chamber, I was conscious of some noise behind me, and I looked around, and I thought, oh, there's my group, who had decided to walk out and join me. So that was the story of what happened. It wasn't planned the way that you might think, but it certainly allowed us to make our point.
Fair enough. It's always good to end with John Burkham. With that said, we have the President of the Debate Society to give a set of closing remarks.
Thank you all for that engaging Q&A session. I'd firstly like to thank Mr. Ian Blackwood for taking time out and being our guest tonight, and for that particularly insightful and enlightening discussion. I'd also like to thank our academic chair, Mr. Joe Greenwood Howe, for chairing this event so effectively, and also Hamza for being an excellent moderator, as always. A big shout out to the Public Debates Committee for putting in so much effort and enthusiasm and making this event happen, so I think they all deserve a big round of applause. In the future, the Favorite series will continue to hold invite guests of that are knowledgeable, and we will continue to discuss issues of primary importance in order to shed more light on them. So hopefully